Hello, everybody. This is JP Saleeby with the Functional Medicine Symposium coming up July 15th. But today I have a special guest, my friend and mentor, Dr. Richard Horowitz, and he's going to talk about his new book and also what he'll be speaking on at our symposium later this year. Richard, you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thanks so much, Yusuf. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I think most of you may know me, but I'm a board certified internist. I've been doing medicine for about the last 35 years. I moved to the Hudson Valley after finishing my internal medicine residency at Mount Sinai in the city back in the 1980s, and ended up moving to the largest Lyme endemic area in the United States. At this point, I've seen over 13,000 chronically ill Lyme patients. Interestingly enough, a lot of what I learned about Lyme disease turns out to be very useful for COVID-19 because a lot of the biochemical pathways and inflammatory pathways that we see in Lyme actually overlap COVID. So I was able to publish a couple of peer-reviewed articles on that. And maybe briefly, we can talk about the overlap between chronic Lyme and long haulers, which is a very important distinction. But the thing that I'd like to speak to you about today, which for me is quite important, is an urgent situation that is now evolving, which is our climate, which I think many people know about. And I have a new book that's about to be released on March 1st. It's called Starseed Revolution, The Awakening. It is a science fiction climate change novel that I started writing back in 2018 when kids were coming into my medical office with climate grief. They had just done the double dose dapsone protocol. They got over Lyme. They were feeling great. And I would say to them routinely, well, what are you going to do with your life? Are you going to go to college? You're going to get a job? And they would say, no. And I said, what do you mean, no? It's like, well, the world's going to end. Why should I bother to get a job and go to college? And, you know, the universe, sometimes when synchronicities arrive, when people keep showing you the same message over and over again, which is what was happening back in 2018, I decided when all these kids were coming in literally day after day, week after week, that I should dive into the climate science to see exactly why they were fearing the future of the Earth. And when I did dive into the climate literature, I realized they were right. We were in big trouble. So I started writing this book 4 years ago, and I did discover solutions for the climate that were not being discussed in the mainstream media. So maybe a bit today on this talk, Yusuf, we'll talk a little bit about how the climate is affecting Lyme and tick-borne diseases, how it's affecting environmental toxicity that's getting into people's bodies. What are some of the solutions that we need to institute immediately? We could talk a little bit about the overlap with chronic Lyme and COVID-19, but essentially some of the urgent solutions that we now need to institute if we're going to save our planet from some of the devastation that is awaiting us in the next couple of years without urgent action.
Right. Well, Richard, that's a great introduction into my next question, which was to explain to the audience the connection about the climate crisis that we're facing currently and in the future and tick-borne illness.
You know, so one of the main reasons that we need to be concerned about the climate, for those of us who've been dealing with tick-borne diseases for the last 30, 40 years, is that as the global temperatures rise, so does the reproductive rate of certain insects. Now, we're presently having a problem with biodiversity. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity has let us know that we are losing 3 species an hour, 150 species a day, and anywhere between 18 to 55,000 species per year. And it's being heralded as the early stages of the Earth's 6th extinction. So I'm not trying to scare you, but I need to tell you the facts, and I will give you the good news at the end of this interview so you don't have to be scared. But we can't stick our heads in the sand. We're in the middle of an early 6th extinction where species are becoming extinct. But unfortunately, the species that are becoming extinct are certain insects and pollinators, like the bees. The bee population is going down in many states, and we need pollinators, as you know, to have food. But also amphibians and reptiles and birds and certain mammals are going extinct. Now, what's not going extinct, unfortunately, are ticks, mosquitoes, and fleas. Their numbers are going up while the crucial species are going down. So ticks and fleas and mosquitoes, their reproductive rates are directly related to outside temperature. So as outside temperatures go up, their reproductive rates go up. So we're seeing already a rise in vector-borne diseases. Vector-borne disease is 70% of global infectious diseases across the world, and it's going to get worse. So we already saw almost 500,000 cases of Lyme disease in the United States last year, according to the CDC. That's not even counting co-infections like Babesia, Bartonella, rickettsial infections, Q fever, tularemia, right? And of course, viral infections like West Nile and Powassan exposure and the rest. So we're already seeing 500,000 cases. The numbers are probably much higher, and it's just going to get worse. And the climate is directly driving that increase in tick-borne disease.
Right, right. So you mentioned Babesia, and when I trained with you a number of years ago up in Hyde Park, New York, and also the last couple of conferences I've attended with ILATs, the emphasis has been on Babesia. Now, for some in the audience, they may not understand that too well. Could you kind of elaborate on what Babesia is and how it affects and how it's linked to the Borrelia and some of the other co-infections?
Yeah, so Babesia is a malaria-like parasite. So when you think of malaria and you have Lyme disease, most of these patients who present with babesiosis present with day sweats, night sweats. Sometimes they can be drenching, shaking chills, fevers, air hunger, the inability to catch your breath, feeling like you're short of breath, but you don't have asthma, you don't have emphysema, and also an unexplained cough. So I have a questionnaire that I published several years ago with Dr. Phyllis Freeman and Dr. Mary Alice Atera from the State University of New Paltz. We published it, I believe, in 2018. And it was a validated symptom questionnaire in 1,600 people, both healthy and sick with Lyme disease. And questions 1 and 22 on that questionnaire, which I refer to as the HMQ, the Horowitz MSIDS questionnaire. If you check off 1 and 22 as positive on that questionnaire, the likelihood of Babesia is actually quite high. Now, the first time I learned about Babesia was, it was probably about 25, almost 30 years ago. A young woman came into my office in a wheelchair. She was paralyzed from the waist down. She could not walk. She had Lyme disease. And she'd been treated by a very good Lyme literate doctor with antibiotics, but still was unable to walk. When I took a clinical history, she told me in her early 30s, she had drenching night sweats. And everything in medicine is always differential diagnosis. So, you know, she didn't have tuberculosis. She didn't have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She didn't have hyperthyroidism. She wasn't in menopause. She didn't have brucellosis, acute fever. She didn't have a severe autoimmune disease. So you do the differential diagnosis. And I said to her, you know, it sounds like Babesia. It's not supposed to be in the Hudson Valley, but I just got back from a course and it said like it might be spreading. We sent out her blood and also ticks to IGeneX and also to Rhode Island University, discovered the ticks had a small amount of babesiosis. She was positive in the blood. I gave her at the time atovaquone and azithromycin, classic treatment for Babesia. And within 10 days, she walked out of the wheelchair. So with all my excitement, like, oh my God, this paralyzed woman walked. Babesia is playing a massive role in keeping these Lyme patients sick. I invited in the health departments. I invited in the HMOs and insurance companies because I was naive at that point. I said, if I discovered something that I feel is helping patients, surely they're going to want to be interested in help patients. Right. Let's just say that my naivety at the time did not actually bear fruit. In fact, they decided that, no, there is no Babesia. They threw me out of their HMO network. I lost 2,000 patients in one fell swoop. And it wasn't probably until 6 or 7 years later that the New York State Department of Health finally admitted that there was babesiosis in the Hudson Valley. I was vindicated, but at that point, of course, my whole practice had changed. But the majority of our sick patients that come in with Lyme disease, who are sick, who are not getting better, they have babesiosis. They also have Bartonella, and there are over 36 different species and subspecies of Bartonella, which is an intracellular bacteria. So I call it the 3 big Bs. It's Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia. Those are the 3 Bs that are affecting a lot of these patients and driving a lot of the inflammatory response that we're seeing, making these Lyme patients sick. And in the last couple of years, we reported, in fact, we were the first people to report it in the literature, Dr. Freeman and myself, that it's not just Babesia microti that we found years ago, but also Babesia duncani, which used to be known as WA1 because it came from Washington. We're finding about half of our patients now have this other Babesia species. So if you go looking for it on antibody testing through lab or LabCorp, Quest, BioReference, and you only do one strain, you're not going to find it. So we use IGeneX laboratories, we do different strains, and I love their Babesia fish test FISH stands for fluorescent in situ hybridization. It's an RNA test where you look under the microscope, and if Babesia is there, it fluoresces green. And it's a very good test for picking up babesiosis in people that may have immune deficiency, not a high enough parasitic load that it's necessarily picked up. So that's kind of a quick overview of babesiosis.
Right. So I also, at conference, you get these Lyme literate doctors that get together and have discussions about which one you attack first. Is it Borrelia, Babesia first, or is it mold? So could you comment a little bit about, should we attack one before the other or all together?
So, I mean, every doctor practices in a different manner. The analogy that I would give you with this is kind of as if you have multiple ninjas attacking your fort. You can't just go after one ninja, because ultimately the ninjas are going to get in and they're going to hurt you. So my approach normally is it's a personalized medicine model. And that personalized medical model, I call MSIDS, multiple systemic infectious disease syndrome. It's a 16-point model. So if you look at the 16-point model, which I have two New York Times and national best-selling books, Why Can't I Get Better? Solving the Mystery of Lyme and Chronic Disease. And my last one in 2017 from St. Martin's Press, How Can I Get Better? An action plan for treating resistant Lyme and chronic disease. The model is explained in detail in that book, but also in peer review articles that I've done with Dr. Freeman. And the essence of it is the following. Lyme patients get sick because of inflammation. In fact, in all acute and chronic disease, it's ultimately inflammation that makes people sick. Whether you're talking about COVID-19, whether you're talking about other diseases, whether it's a heart attack, strokes, Alzheimer's, it's all from inflammation. In Lyme patients, there are usually multiple sources of inflammation that are making them sick. So first on the MSIDS map is infections. You've got bacteria like Bartonella, Lyme, Q fever, tularemia, Brucella, rickettsial infections, Anaplasma, Ehrlichia, Mycoplasma. There's a lot of different infections. But the second part of the model afterwards is that you can have inflammation and autoimmunity, right? Immune dysfunction. And what happens is when you get these environmental toxins in your body, like mold, like heavy metals that are showing up in most of our patients, it is driving an inflammatory response. So I call it the 3 I's. Infections and inflammation is driving autoimmunity, this immune dysfunction, and it's making people sick. But you also have other sources of inflammation. If you're a Lyme patient, you generally don't fall asleep or keep waking up in the middle of the night. That drives inflammation with a specific inflammatory molecule called interleukin-6, which is produced during COVID. It's produced during Lyme. So it's one of these inflammatory molecules that you've got to shut down. That's why Lyme patients need to get to sleep. But also we find that when you're dealing with all of these environmental toxins, you're using up a lot of your detox support, including minerals like zinc, copper, magnesium. Now, if you don't have enough zinc, you're going to get a lot of inflammation in the body. They showed this not just with Lyme, but also with COVID-19. And if the microbiome of your gut is off, the wrong Prevotella species, Clostridium species, you're going to get inflammation. We now know that the microbiome is very important. And a lot of these patients I see have leaky gut with multiple food allergies, and many of them have mast cell activation. Now, the cytokines, the inflammatory molecules produced from the gut, from these eating the wrong foods, right, not being off gluten and dairy and sugar and wheat and these things, drives the same inflammation you can get from Lyme. So it's like having multiple sources of inflammation. It's like rivers flowing into an ocean of inflammation. And what this inflammation does is it has downstream effects. Mitochondrial dysfunction, hurting the mitochondria of the body, which is the main powerhouse, causing the hypothalamic pituitary axis, where your hormones come from, to be shut down. You may have thyroid dysfunction. Many people have low adrenal. Men get low testosterone, right? You can get liver dysfunction, right? Autoimmunity. So you can think of this model kind of as multiple sources of inflammation and downstream effects. And it's like going into a doctor's office with 16 nails in your foot, telling the doctor you have foot pain. If you don't find all the nails and the doctor pulls out one and says, come back in a month, you're going to come back and say, hey, doc, I still got foot pain. You got to treat and find the Babesia, the Bartonella, the food allergies, the leaky gut, the mast cell. You got to get them to sleep. You got to deal with the environmental toxins. You got to deal with the downstream effects of mitochondrial and hormone. So if you use the MSIDS model as a checklist, a lot of these patients with chronic diseases, whether you call it chronic Lyme, PTLDS, whatever you call it, it's going to help a lot of these people that are suffering with chronic illness.
Right, absolutely. So in the nomenclature now, there's new terminology out there: mast cell activation and CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. Can you comment about that and how that's related to MSIDS?
So, in mast cell disorder, you can get mast cell activation. There are cells in the body, mast cells, basophils, that secrete histamine and a whole bunch of inflammatory mediators. And I'll give you a great example. So, for example, my wife, who is sick, I call her the MSIDS gal because she had literally every 16 point on the MSIDS map. And if you read the article I published about 2 years ago on double dose dapsone combination therapy, I have 3 case studies. One of them happens to be my wife. You'll figure it out if you read it. And the last part of the puzzle for her, apart from using double dose dapsone therapy, which is an 8-week protocol that knocked the Lyme out into remission for 3.5 years. And we've shown that this protocol, it's an 8-week protocol. And if you don't have active Bartonella and Babesia, you've got roughly a 50% shot of going into long-term remission, as long as you've addressed all of the other factors on the MSIDS map that are making you sick. But in CIRS, this chronic inflammatory response syndrome, that essentially is MSIDS, because the MSIDS model is based on factors causing inflammation, as we talked about, with downstream effects. And part of that inflammation could come from mold causing CIRS, or it may come from mast cell disorder because you've got mold actually causing it, or Lyme-induced mast cell. It's called PIMCAS, pathogen-induced mast cell activation. So the inflammation can come from multiple sources, from inflammation, from mold, from environmental toxins. But the point is, the inflammation, there are several inflammatory pathways that have to be blocked. NF-kappa B, NAC, alpha lipoic acid glutathione, is very helpful. That's one of the main switches that you turn on with inflammation in Lyme and COVID. The NLRP3 inflammasome pathway, you can see it with Lyme, you see it with COVID. Melatonin blocks that one. And the NRF2 pathway, which is stimulated with things like curcumin turmeric, broccoli seed extract, resveratrol, green tea. So you can modulate the pathways with these natural substances, but ultimately you've got to get to the underlying sources with an S of where the inflammation is coming from. So whether you call it mast cell or you call it, CIRS, the point is the MSIDS model is a very useful model. I've done this for over 13,000 people in, over 30 years. It's a model I would suggest if you're a regular doc, a functional medicine doc, keep the checklist right by your side when you're seeing these chronically ill patients. It's really going to help you get to the underlying sources of why these people are sick.
Great, very good. So the elephant in the room is COVID-19. I've seen that virus and also maybe some of the vaccines reactivate Lyme that's been in remission. We had a great year in 2019. I had the highest number of patients go into remission with their Lyme and co-infections. And then the pandemic hit and I saw them all fall apart, those that got infected with COVID. Can you comment a little bit about the COVID-19 connection with Lyme and also what's going on with protocols for long haulers or post-COVID syndrome?
Sure. So, the issue with acute COVID or long haulers, which they're now calling PASC, there's a lot of different words for it, right. Post-acute symptoms of COVID. The symptoms overlap both acute and chronic Lyme. So if you look at both diseases, there's fevers, there's sweats, there's fatigue, there's post-exertional fatigue, there's hair loss, there's memory concentration problems, there's POTS dysautonomia, there's insomnia, there's anxiety, depression, psychosis, there's chest pain, shortness of breath, muscle pain, joint pain, neuropathy. Literally, all the symptoms overlap, except there's a couple of key factors. Now, early on when Delta was around, we saw loss of smell and taste, right? So we saw anosmia, dysgeusia. You don't get that with Lyme. The only time we used to see that in the medical literature is with chronic neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which would cause loss of sense of smell. That's actually how you can identify an early case of Alzheimer's years before you get the significant cognitive dysfunction. So, and with COVID-19, they're now finding Alzheimer's markers in the blood. They're finding tau proteins. They're finding neurofilament light. They're finding these markers of brain damage in the blood of people who have COVID-19 because of neuroinflammation from these small cells in the brain called microglial cells that when they activate, they turn on all these inflammatory pathways that we were just talking about. So the symptoms overlap, but you don't really get the loss of smell or taste with Lyme, right? And also the migratory aspect of pain in Lyme disease, where you have migratory joint pain, migratory muscle pain, and especially migratory nerve pain, tingling, numbness, burning, stabbing sensation. Migratory nerve pain is the hallmark of Lyme. There is no other disease on the planet that causes that. And when we published the HMQ study on the Horowitz MSIDS questionnaire several years ago, we found that there were only 7 causes of migratory pain in the medical literature, right? And I joke sometimes that unless you graduated at the bottom of your medical school class, you should be able to tell the difference between a case of Lyme with migratory pain from acute rheumatic fever, from acute hepatitis, where your AST and ALT are in the thousands, from Reiter syndrome with reactivation, right, from chlamydia and certain other bugs,
Right.
From having lupus, right, from having inflammatory bowel disease, right. There are certain other diseases that very clearly, gonococcal arthritis, right? You're not going to mistake that for Lyme. So there are 6 other diseases apart from Lyme that cause migratory pain. So you just have to do the differential. But if someone has chronic Lyme, the problem, of course, is they could get COVID-19. And then what you're dealing with is you're dealing with Lyme on top of being a long hauler, right? So what does that really mean? Well, it just means that you've just gotten a virus in that's just causing more inflammation in your body. Now, we published the first article in the world literature on potential glutathione deficiency in COVID-19. We published it in April 2020 in one of the American Journal of Respiratory case reports. And we found that in several patients, these were case studies, that within an hour of giving them glutathione when they had COVID pneumonia, they told us that their symptoms immediately got better. Now, at the time, I did not have obviously all the research that people in the ICUs with COVID actually had glutathione deficiency. That was shown later on. And this study was actually cited at this point over 150 times. So we find the same thing, obviously, in Lyme disease. So the overlaps with COVID and Lyme symptom-wise are great, but Lyme has symptoms where they come and go with good and bad days, right? The joint pain, the muscle pain, the nerve pain migrates. In women, it gets worse around the hormones, right? Estrogen goes down, Lyme symptoms come up. You will see the symptoms get better or worse with antibiotics, right? If it gets better, it's because you're knocking down the load of Borrelia. If it gets worse, it's because you're getting a cytokine release, a Herxheimer reaction, right? Like we're seeing with cytokine storms with COVID. And that's the way you can differentiate, by the way. Those are the kind of the 6 signs and symptoms of Lyme that help you to differentiate it from COVID. But ultimately, remember, you could be a long hauler who gets bit by a tick and have both diseases, or be a Lyme patient to get COVID. So you should know that there can be an overlap. And what they found now with COVID-19 is that if you were one of these patients that had the viral RNA in your blood, and you reactivated Epstein-Barr virus, and you had underlying inflammation like type 2 diabetes and the rest, those are the people that got the sickest. But we found that if we gave them ivermectin, 0.2 milligrams per kilo, once a day for 14 days, with NAC, glutathione, alpha-lipoic acid, blocking NF-kappa B, curcumin broccoli seed extract, stimulating NRF2, melatonin at bedtime, blocking the NLRP3 inflammasomes, with vitamin D, which has now been shown to be a major risk factor in the severity of COVID-19, lowest vitamin D levels, the sickest the people were with COVID, along with some zinc, because zinc deals with monocyte function and inflammation in the body. We would give them beta-glucan, which raises natural killer cells and T cells, the kind of cells you need to fight viruses. When we did all of this, we had 125 patients we treated who had chronic Lyme with acute COVID. No one died. I did not have one person that died in over 2 years during this pandemic. Only 2 went into the hospital. One was completely immune deficient, right? And the other one was a 75-year-old woman who had been vaxxed, but still got sick, ended up on a vent, actually the only one in my practice, but fortunately survived. So, you know, there is a great overlap between the 2 diseases. If you want to see the protocol I used for COVID-19, just go on my medical website, www.cangetbetter, all one word.com. Look under the COVID tab and you will see the prevention and treatment protocols. You will also see, by the way, the randomized trial that we're about to start at the University of California, Irvine, looking at the MSIDS model and glutathione deficiency in these long haulers. Our 501c3 foundation, the MSIDS Research Foundation, has given $500,000 towards the University of California, Irvine to do this study. We had to go through the FDA for an IND for an investigation of new drug, but hopefully this randomized trial will start soon. And we may find that the MSIDS model actually is applicable. And in fact, we already know it is because it's reactivation of Epstein-Barr in infections, that we know it's mitochondrial dysfunction. We know that POTS dysautonomia, which shows up in chronic Lyme, is showing up in long COVID. So we already know that there's an overlap with the MSIDS model with some of the things we're seeing in long COVID.
Right. So you mentioned glutathione quite a bit. We use it in our practice. It's a little tricky administering. How do you best administer your glutathione?
We do it orally, and whether you use a liposomal formulation, we use one called Essential Pro, which comes from Birmingham, Alabama, from one of our compounders. You can still use regular glutathione. Now, IV glutathione, and the few of the patients that we gave it said absolutely it was quicker, it was very effective, but still, we were using up to 2,000 milligrams of oral glutathione up to 3 times per day in people that had COVID. We would double up the NAC from 600 twice a day to 1,200. And the interesting part, by the way, about NAC and glutathione is they've been proven to be antiviral before COVID ever came around. There's published research on glutathione that it is effective against influenza virus, dengue fever, hepatitis, HIV. And part of the beauty is the virus attaches to the ACE2 receptors of your cells, but glutathione and NAC have sulfa groups called thiol groups. And what may be happening is that the virus is attaching to these thiol groups instead of attaching to your ACE2 receptors. And the only way the virus can turn on the viral machinery in the cells to replicate is through oxidative stress and inflammation. But glutathione and NAC help block that inflammatory response. So when the virus enters your cells, it lowers glutathione and it upregulates IL-6 by turning on this switch inside the nucleus called NF-kappa B. But you block NF-kappa B with glutathione, NAC, and alpha-lipoic acid, right? It also showed that the virus downregulates NRF2, which is one of your inflammatory pathways. So if you upregulate NRF2, turmeric, curcumin, broccoli seed extract, resveratrol, green tea, that also lowers glutathione. By giving glutathione and blocking this inflammatory response, it looks like biochemically, we can help people get a handle on the virus. Now, I've done it for 125 patients. Obviously, it's not a randomized trial, but I can tell you from my experience, it's clear to me that this worked for patients. And I think that's why we didn't see any mortalities in our practice during the last 2 years.
Right. Fantastic. Yeah, I'll definitely post that link on our websites for my patients and for the audience to access. So I think you and I and all the doctors that are practicing good medicine are going to be super busy with the post-COVID syndromes and that for many, many, many years, helping folks out. One last thing, I've got 2 more questions for you, Richard. Any on the horizon or in your current practice, talk about herbals, because some of my patients are just, they want to do the herbal route and they're kind of wary about some of the pharmaceuticals. So what choices do I have for helping them out with herbal or more natural remedies?
Well, so in the last several years, they showed that Lyme as well as Bartonella exist under biofilms. So, I mean, there are essential oils that come from cinnamon, clove, oregano, peppermint. There's things like biocidin, stevia from Nutrimetics, enzymes like serapeptase. There are things that can open up biofilms. And certainly over the years, we've used cemento, banderol, Cowden protocols, traditional Chinese protocols with Coptis, HH, circulation P, R50131. I mean, we've seen help with herbals. There's no doubt about it. But what I will say is these herbals do not have the ability to hit the persisters that are in the biofilms. So, for the patients that only want to do natural, it's not that you can't get help by addressing all 16 points on the MSIDS map and using herbal therapies. You can get help. But are you going to cure someone, get down the load of the bacteria low enough that it's not going to keep relapsing? Truthfully, it's unlikely. You're going to need to do other things than just herbals if you're going to try and knock this out. And the only 2 persister drugs that we have at this point in time are dapsone, which I've published several articles in the peer-reviewed medical literature, as well as disulfiram. And I will be publishing a new article coming this summer on pulse high-dose dapsone combination therapy, just like I learned about double-dose combination therapy several years ago when one of my patients made a mistake and took a double dose and then went in remission for a year, which is the regimen that put my wife in remission now for 3.5 years. It's the same thing. Someone made a mistake going into her second month. She accidentally took a higher dose. We tried this on some of the resistant patients, and I'm talking 8-day protocols. I'm talking 8-day pulses.
Now, is this Richard, is this an 8-day protocol of the combination of dapsone and disulfiram?
Some are dapsone disulfiram, some are dapsone doxyrifampin with or without Citromax, but yes, but 8-day protocols.
Okay.
I'm going to have to collect the data, but I think probably at least half actually did take disulfiram. And what we found is in some of these people with resistant symptoms that had Bartonella, primarily a lot of these cases I suspect are going to be Bartonella fish positive, but I have not yet gone through all 40, 45 medical records to look at it. But I know from speaking to these patients, I just spoke to 2 of them yesterday, they're doing incredibly well after this protocol. And the reason they're most likely doing well is we know that double dose dapsone combination therapy works. And when we did the culture studies, it showed that the higher the dose of these biofilm persister drugs, the better it worked against these biofilm persister forms of Borrelia. So it would make sense if 200 of dapsone worked, 400 of dapsone might work better, except there's side effects when you go up, which is why you have to do it short term, and you have to know how to modulate the effects with higher dose methylene blue, higher dose glutathione to reverse methemoglobin, higher dose folic acid, although 8 days of dapsone, you don't usually see a lot of anemia, which is actually quite beneficial. But I will have this for patients in the future that say, please only give me herbals. I don't want to do antibiotics. This will be an option for people that are worried about the microbiome of their gut. And they don't want to take pharmaceuticals. But I will tell you from my extensive experience of treating over 13,000 people, you need persister drugs and you need biofilm agents. So yes, the herbs are useful. They can knock down the load, but I do not believe that it's going to completely knock it out. So that's an important distinction that people need to know.
Right. And I think an 8-day course is a short enough course that that would be kind of intriguing and something that those folks might embrace as opposed to.
No, I don't. By the way, I don't know if most of these people who did this already did the double dose dapsone protocol and failed. Like, in other words, they had Bartonella, they had something else interfering.
Right.
We know the double dose dapsone combination protocol with doxyrifampin dapsone has about a 50% success rate, but the ones who failed it primarily were active BART, followed by Babesia, as long as the MSID's variable. So I suspect a lot of these patients already did it. I don't know how it's going to work in people that have never done dapsone ever or disulfiram. I have no idea, but it's intriguing because what it's showing is that there may be shorter, quicker protocols we can design. And of course, these will need to be tested in randomized controlled trials.
Sure. Very good. Well, my last question is more on the political side of treating Lyme. And that's, we know there was a working group on Capitol Hill a number of years ago started. Can you comment on what's going on in Washington, D.C. and the HHS?
Well, I'll comment actually on 2 sides politically. I'll comment on what's happening with HHS and Lyme, but also politically what's happening with the climate, because as we talked about when we began this podcast, the 2 are actually direct related. So we're in the 3rd round right now of the HHS tick-borne disease working group. And we have some very good people on the committee. This morning, my wife told me, and I didn't know this, that there was a person on the committee. I'm not going to say the name, but my wife told me the name, that one of these people publicly had said, oh, there's no such thing as chronic Lyme disease. It doesn't persist. It's like, oh my God, it's Eugene Shapiro all over again. It's like, what do you look for these people year after year just to create, we'd say in the Jewish religion, surus, like difficulties and sadness for everyone? So I know that they need a balanced approach. I got it. And what I have suggested to HHS when I was on the committee and worked as co-chair of the HHS co-infection subcommittee is that for about $500,000, I learned that you can answer 1 question, right? Or maybe 2, but maximum $1 million. And what would be the questions that honestly they should do during this 3rd round? To get through this political gridlock that has existed now for 35 years, tests are reliable. Oh, no, they're not. Lyme disease doesn't persist. Oh, yes, it does. The way to get through this is you've got to do a peer review search, and it's got to be done through HHS. So if you give money, HHS will answer 1 question, are tests reliable? And another $500,000, does Lyme persist? So whoever on the committee is saying Borrelia doesn't persist, if you devote a certain amount of funds, they will do a complete peer review medical literature search, right, throughout time, of what exactly does the medical literature say. not what this particular person said, but what does the peer review literature say? I believe it's the only way we're going to get through the political gridlock. And I've told this to Holiday, and who's now co-chair of the committees, and I've said it on my Facebook page. And for those, by the way, who want to follow what I do with the climate and with Lyme and the rest, my Facebook site where I post most of this is Dr. Dr. Richard Horowitz. Every day, pretty much, I'm posting something on Lyme or the climate. So, but the other political gridlock, I will tell you right now, that for me is just as important or more important, is the climate. And why. Right now, the major world institutions are saying we're going to try and become climate neutral by the year 2050. And I will tell you why this is a big problem. There are certain things happening. You know, everyone has seen the wildfires and the increase in hurricanes and mold infested buildings from the hurricanes. We've seen droughts in Arizona and California, the worst in 2,000 years. We've seen a rise in vector-borne diseases. We've seen heat-related illness with heat strokes, right? Everyone has seen these things, but what you're not seeing and what the mainstream media is not talking about is the loss of biodiversity. Is the fact that we are in the early stages of the sixth extinction, as I talked about earlier, based on the UN Convention of Biological Diversity. So if we lose up to 25 to 33% of these species, insects, mammals, reptilians, and avian species, we're not going to be able to produce food, and the ecosystem is going to collapse. And that means that we're in big trouble for humanity. That's number one. So we need to protect and restore 50% of the world's lands and oceans right now if we're going to survive. Secondly, we have the ability right now, because if you look at what's going on globally, we're now involved in a war. We just got through a pandemic, right? And we can't even get the Build Back Better Act through the United States Congress. But what people don't realize is the US military and the Department of Defense published an article and a report in 2019 saying the climate is a major security risk for this country. You learn as Americans, if you see something, say something. I am saying something to you that we have a major national security risk, which is unfolding right now. The US Army and NASA has already told us. Why are we worried? Because of wildfires, because of flooding, because of diversification, desertification. But there is a glacier right now in Antarctica, in West Antarctica, called the Thwaites Glacier. In 3 to 5 years, they just published this about 6 weeks ago from the American Geophysical Union. This glacier is cracking, and they suspect that it's going to fall off and collapse into the ocean within the next 3 to 5 years. Well, the Thwaites Glacier is the size of Florida, and they're expecting that it falls into the ocean and it collapses. It's going to raise global sea levels by over 2 feet. That means that good parts of New York City, Brooklyn, Miami, coastal cities in the US, Amsterdam, Venice, China, Bangladesh, they're all going to be underwater in the next 3 to 5 years. So what you're not hearing about is the fact that we have a way of reversing this, and it's called geoengineering. There are solutions in my new book, Starseed Revolution, The Awakening, which is out March 1st. It's on Amazon. It's going to be out next Tuesday. And it shows that we can geoengineer the Arctic with millions of miles of solar reflectors, which come from Harvard scientists. There are volcanoes in the past that cooled the planet, like in 1991, the Philippines volcano, it cooled the planet by 0.5 degrees centigrade. We need to cool the planet now and stop this big ice cube, the Thwaites Glacier, from melting and falling to the ocean. If we mimic volcanoes by putting sulfates at 60,000 feet in the atmosphere, we can block the sunlight and cool down the Arctic, because the Arctic is heating up 2 to 5 times faster than North America. And as it's heating up and the permafrost is melting, it's releasing methane, which is 30 to 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So we need to geoengineer, cloud brightening, sulfates, solar reflectors. There's answers, but we need to do this immediately. And America, the United States, can do this unilaterally. We do not need India, Russia, China, or any European Union to do this. We can do this, and we can help save the world from global sea level rise. But I need the political factors, just going back to politics, as we talked about. There's this congressional committees and Senate that, you know, the Republicans and Dems have been fighting, but we need to put the fighting aside for the American people and for the global community. This is a really big problem, but we have solutions. And the problem that we're also going to face is with the food supply, because as the pollinators go down and we have droughts and we flood the plains, we're going to lose the food supply. So there's ways of doing what's called regenerative agriculture, where we can now have a new way of creating food and not putting nitrates and nitric oxide, which warms the planet 300 times more than carbon dioxide. There's ways of changing the way we have food production. So we need to electrify everything. Wind, water, solar. Mark Jacobson from Stanford University published in the journal One Earth, 139 countries can become completely neutral and carbon neutral right now with wind, water, solar. And Elon Musk did the calculations. If we take 100 square mile area in the California, Nevada, Arizona desert with solar panels with present efficiency, it would completely give us enough power to fuel the entire United States to get off fossil fuels. We need to do this now. We need to electrify everything with wind, water, solar. We need geoengineering. We need regenerative agriculture, and we need to protect 50% of the lands and oceans. These are 4 solutions for the climate that are urgent if we are to protect our country and the world at large. They are explained in detail in Starseed Revolution, along with what happens with the world. The book starts in the year 2037, and it shows what happens when we don't institute these solutions. So I would encourage everyone, please, I'm trying to get a voice of the climate dialogue to help us with vector-borne diseases and Lyme that's rising, but we have solutions we need to institute immediately. And I'm hoping to get a voice with all of you reading the book. Everyone who's read it told me it's very funny. It's very informative. I think you'll like a lot of the Lyme jokes that are in there. It talks about environmental toxins and what they're doing to our bodies. But we need everybody now to come together. This is a great time for the Lyme and functional medicine community to come together and say, hey, we've got solutions. Well, we now need to come together as a group and say, we can save the world. We have 4 pillars of solutions that Dr. H just talked about. Let's come together and figure out how we're going to get our politics in order to do it for this country, to do it for the world. So I would just encourage you all to please be on board for the future generations, for the present and future generations. We must do this now with love and compassion, so that we can save the future generations from tremendous suffering that's about to unfold.
Richard, it's always amazing when I get together with you for conversations or listen to you lecture. And we are so looking forward to your presentation mid-July in our symposium. But I must thank you again for your time today to talk to our group.
It's my pleasure, Yusuf. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and I look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Always. Bye.